This lecture presentation marks the beginning of Unit 2, which will be based on Robert Sapolsky's Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. As always, I recommend having the interactive study guide available so that you can complete it as we move through the lecture presentation, and also to have the slides nearby so you can take notes on any material that's not covered on the slides. We'll start with a brief in-class activity. For this activity, it would be helpful for you to close your eyes, but if that's uncomfortable for any reason, you can just lightly gaze at whatever is in front of you. I want you to pay attention to what happens in your body as we move through the activity. Here we go. No, 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 no. Yes, 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 yes. This activity was designed by Dr. Dan Siegel, and I experienced it firsthand at a presentation of his. He used this activity to illustrate the yes brain and the no brain. He has a book called The Yes Brain that dives into this more deeply if it's something you're interested in. Essentially, the no brain is a state of reactivity. The no brain is hopefully what you experienced during the activity when I was saying the word no. Many people, in response to this activity, will notice that while no is said, particularly in a harsh voice, that they experience stress in the body. You might have noticed muscular tension, racing heart, sweating, or cognitive response. Maybe, I don't like this is annoying, this is frustrating, this doesn't feel good. Both physiological and cognitive changes in response to stress are normal and are adaptive. The no brain is essentially a reaction to threat. From an evolutionary perspective, our response to threat is about survival, not happiness. And so it is set up for us to respond to stress in a way that helps us survive. But in present day, our stress responses are actually less about survival and more about emotional, psychological stresses. And in those cases, our stress responses don't necessarily feel as adaptive as they're intended to be. The no brain is associated with excessive differentiation. Essentially, that means that the brain is not as integrated as it is when it's in a yes brain state. This excessive differentiation impairs interpersonal and intrapersonal functioning. Now, you might have experienced in your no brain state how easy it was for you to have a stress response. Keep in mind, this is just a video with the word no, and yet you responded potentially as though a bear was present. The yes brain is a state of social engagement. Many of you may have experienced a sense of relief, maybe physiologically in terms of maybe your muscles relaxing, or cognitively thinking, oh, good, that's over, this is better. The yes brain is open to new experiences and open to learning. Dan Siegel uses the acronym BRIE to describe the outcome of the yes brain, which includes balance, resilience, insight, and empathy. He argues that the yes brain supports neural integration. So unlike the no brain that's excessively differentiated, the yes brain is built on grit and growth mindset. In terms of parenting and education, creating a yes brain state is essential for helping the developing child or adult to take in new information and to create meaning and long-lasting change from it. Any discussion of stress warrants a discussion of homeostasis and allostasis. Homeostasis is the ongoing maintenance and defense of vital physiological variables. It's an attempt at balance. Homeostatic set points can be adjusted, for example, weight, but it is difficult to change a set point. Homeostasis is essentially a self-regulating negative feedback system. Its job is to maintain the constancy of the internal environment. The concept of homeostasis is similar to an air conditioning system. The thermostat is set at 73 degrees. When the temperature is raised above 73 degrees, the air conditioner turns on to bring the temperature back down to 73 degrees. If it's a very smart system and it gets too cold, it should turn on the heater to bring it back up to 73 degrees. In much the same way, homeostasis is largely a reactive defense of fixed set points that do not persist after the set point is restored. Allostasis is a similar but different concept. Allostasis is the process by which the body responds to stressors in order to regain homeostasis. Here, rather than a reactive defense of fixed set points, it's a process of achieving stability through change. The concept of allostasis addresses the effects of complex psychosocial stressors on the physiological process. That is, rather than maintaining a set point, changes occur to cope with present demands. It's not about a fixed set point, it's about what is needed in the present situation. The allostatic load is the cost of responding, and it's higher than with the homeostatic load. Homeostatic load is less costly because it's an efficient coordination of responses. An allostatic state is a chronic deviation from homeostasis. In general, allostasis may best describe the stress response, but homeostasis fits for most other processes. So what is stress? First, let's start with a stressor. A stressor is anything that throws the body out of allostatic balance. That includes any events, situations, thoughts, feelings, etc. that disrupt or threaten to disrupt a person's daily life or well-being. Physical stressors would include extreme temperature, injury, or illness, whereas psychological stressors include feeling rejected or worrying about being rejected, being lied to, being disappointed. Psychological stressors, like physical stressors, often have a physical component. So what are some potential stressors? Life changes, situations that need us to adapt or adjust. And that includes positive or seemingly negative life changes. So that could be stress associated with a wedding as much as associated with a death of a loved one. Catastrophic events, things that occur suddenly and without warning and require huge adaptation. For example, a massive flood or earthquake. Daily hassles. Daily hassles are seemingly minor, but the impact adds up over time. For example, if you experience rush hour traffic to and from your job 5 days a week, traffic in and of itself might not be a huge stressor, but when you experience hours of it each day, it does accumulate and become a much bigger stressor. And then we have chronic stressors, ongoing and long-term. This is the opposite of an acute stressor. Chronic stressors wear people down over time. For example, living paycheck to paycheck for a short period of time may be stressful to a degree, but not overwhelming. But over time, that chronic stressor wears people down and becomes perceived as a bigger and bigger stressor over time. So stress is our emotional, behavioral, and physiological process of responding to stressors. It's the body's attempt to restore allostasis. Stress occurs as people try to adjust and deal with stressors that exceed or that seem to exceed their ability to cope. What's most important here is the perception of the ability to cope, not the actual ability to cope. In the short term, stress responses tend to be adaptive. It's really only problematic when we can't appropriately turn it on or off. Part of the stress response is to halt repair, to halt reproduction and ovulation, and to halt work on other long-term projects. You can see in the short term why this might not be very problematic, but over time, it means that the body is not able to rest and repair itself. One thing that we see quite often is that individuals who have high levels of stress often experience difficulties with fertility. That means getting pregnant and maintaining a viable pregnancy. It's interesting that for a lot of individuals who experience infertility, when they quote-unquote give up on the process of getting pregnant, oftentimes they're surprised when they get pregnant soon after. It's the stress that often impairs the ability to get pregnant in the first place. Another aspect of stress is that it's a constant mobilization of energy. So if it's happening for a long period of time, we run out of our energy surplus. That makes it more and more difficult to deal with stress over time. Stress also involves this psychological response, which is impacted by many variables, including our personalities, our sex, and our coping skills. You'll notice at the bottom that there's a graph. And this graph is a graph of calm, or eustress versus de-stress. Does it remind you of anything? Hopefully what comes to mind is the same curve we looked at for norepinephrine and executive functioning, which we talked about in terms of ADHD in an earlier lecture. Now, another important thing to understand about the relationship between stress and stressors is that there are mediators that influence how we respond to stressors. For example, how we appraise the stressor. What do we think about it? Predictability. Do we believe that we know what's coming? Control. Do we perceive ourselves as having the ability to influence what's happening? Coping resources and methods. Do we believe that we have sufficient coping skills to deal with the stressor? And social support. Do we experience the world in such a way that we believe that we are going to be effectively supported in terms of the stressor? All of those stress mediators influence how people respond to the stressors in terms of their individual stress response. So essentially, mediating factors are those factors that minimize or magnify the impact of the stressor. We'll discuss more of these mediating factors in our last lecture of the course on resilience and coping. For the rest of the lecture presentation, we'll be discussing the physical stress response. But I do want to point out that psychological responses are also quite powerful. Before we move on, can you think of any examples of psychological responses to stress? Some examples might be rumination, continually thinking about the stressor, catastrophizing, thinking about the worst case scenario, avoidance, trying to do anything you can not to think about that stressor and not to deal with it, aggression, to act out the stress in a violent way, or to escape, to get away from the stressor as much as possible, oftentimes using substances like drugs and alcohol. Historically, research into the stress response has been based on males. Therefore, there's a lot we don't know about differences between the sexes in terms of their stress response. Personality also plays a large role in influencing our perception of stressors and our stress responses. Disease-prone personalities are individuals who generally try to ignore stressors when possible. They perceive stressors as long-term, catastrophic events, and they tend to see them as brought on by themselves. That is, that they're at fault. They tend to be pessimistic about their ability to overcome stressors. In contrast, disease-resistant personalities are those individuals who think of stressors as temporary challenges to be overcome. This is very consistent with growth mindset. Unlike disease-prone personalities, they don't tend to blame themselves for causing these stressors. Oftentimes, they experience what's known as dispositional optimism. That is, the belief or the expectation that things will work out well. They tend to engender traits such as hope, resilience, conscientiousness, and curiosity. When it comes to personality, conscientiousness can also be thought of as social dependability, and it's been found to be one of the most important predictors of a long life. In general, women are exposed to more psychosocial stressors throughout their lifetimes. They tend to respond to stressors with less anger and less avoidance than males. Females are more likely to help others and to make use of social support. This has led to the saying that females may tend and befriend rather than fight or flight. This was coined by Shelley Taylor at UCLA. The interpretation of the differences between how females and males respond to stress is influenced by the hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin leads to a pull towards bonding and sociality, and since women tend to have higher levels of oxytocin, this may influence their move to tend and befriend rather than to engage in fight or flight strategies. The fight-flight pattern is stronger in males. This is partly because of gender differences in how oxytocin interacts with sex hormones. In males, it amplifies the physical response, whereas in females, it reduces the physical response. It explains why males and female children respond to stress similarly. The changes take place around adolescence when sex hormone differences are more pronounced. Now that we've reviewed a bit about some of the individual variability in the stress response, let's talk about the nervous system. The nervous system is broadly subdivided into two major divisions. This includes the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system contains all nerves outside of the brain and spinal cord. As you can see in the image, the central nervous system is central to the body. It is medial, and it is colored in yellow. The rest of the nerves of the nervous system are colored in purple and represent the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is further subdivided into the somatic and autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system includes the sensory and voluntary motor. That means sensory neurons, which are afferent to the central nervous system, that is, arrive to the spinal cord, and the motor neurons that are efferent to the central nervous system, that is, are directed towards the skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system covers our involuntary processes, and it is further subdivided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. You might have heard of the sympathetic nervous system referred to as the fight or flight system. That's because activation of the sympathetic nervous system is associated with energy mobilization. That's our stress response and our survival response. The parasympathetic nervous system is sometimes referred to as the rest and digest system, and that's because the parasympathetic branch is tasked with energy conservation. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for automatic processes. It carries messages back and forth between the brain and other organs and glands. Whereas the sympathetic branch is the mobilizing system that's dominant when stressed, the parasympathetic branch is the energy conserving system that's dominant when we are relaxed. The autonomic nervous system also contains the vagus nerve, that is cranial nerve 10, as well as 3 other cranial nerves. These 4 cranial nerves are oftentimes referred to as mixed cranial nerves because they have efferent, afferent, and autonomic functions. The other 3 cranial nerves are the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5, the facial nerve, cranial nerve 7, and the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve 9. The autonomic nervous system is the major player in our response to stress. When it comes to the sympathetic nervous system, preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, whereas postganglionic neurons release norepinephrine. For the parasympathetic nervous system, acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter at both the preganglionic and postganglionic branches. As you can see in the image, our body undergoes drastic changes depending on whether the sympathetic division or the parasympathetic division is active at any given time. When we undergo a stress response, epinephrine initiates a cascade of changes in cells of various organs. The liver helps to convert glycogen to glucose. The heart excites cardiac cells to beat faster. The digestive system undergoes vasoconstriction to slow digestive processes. The muscles undergo vasodilation to get more blood flow, particularly to those major muscle groups that are essential for survival. When we experience stress, the sympathetic nervous system is activated. Efferent motor neurons in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, in the thoracic and lumbar regions, get excited. Those axons project relatively short distances before they synapse with ganglia, which are a cluster of cell bodies. As I mentioned, preganglionic fibers release acetylcholine, whereas the postganglionic cells project axons for longer distances and release norepinephrine to the target tissue. The parasympathetic response is quite different. It is suppressed in response to stress. That is, it is dominant when we are relaxed. Efferent motor neurons located either in the brain, including cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, or of the ventral horn of the spinal cord in the sacral region. Preganglionic fibers travel long distances from the spinal cord and release acetylcholine. Postganglionic are relatively short and release acetylcholine directly to organs. This facilitates vegetative and non-emergency responses. Interestingly, although the majority of the regions displayed in the picture receive sympathetic and parasympathetic input, the adrenal glands, sweat glands, and hair erector muscles receive sympathetic input only. Based on what you see in the picture, can you figure out what side effects might result from raising or lowering acetylcholine or norepinephrine in the peripheral nervous system? For example, what might happen to blood pressure? Would the person experience dry mouth, urinary retention, or blurred vision? The physiological stress response begins with the amygdala, which is essentially the watchdog of the nervous system. Its job is to pay attention to what to bark at. The amygdala sends distress signals to the hypothalamus, which is essentially the conductor of the autonomic nervous system. Stressors trigger the release of corticotropin-releasing hormone, also known as CRH, from the amygdala and the hypothalamus. You'll notice in the picture, inside of the brain in purple, it says CRF. CRF is the older term for CRH. It is no longer referred to as CRF because it was identified as a hormone. The F stood for factor, which was a placeholder. CRH acts as both a hormone in the peripheral nervous system as well as a neurotransmitter in the stress response circuits. That includes the hippocampus, locus coeruleus, cortex, and hypothalamus. Whereas the SAM response is initiated very quickly and occurs within seconds, the HPA response takes minutes. In fact, it's generally a full 10 minutes before the entire response is mounted by the HPA axis. The adrenal glands are subdivided into two glands that actually merge during embryonic development. The adrenal medulla is the inner part of the adrenal gland. It receives input from preganglionic fibers of the sympathetic nervous system. Chromaffin cells secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, and that is the part of this response that is oftentimes referred to as the fight or flight response. In the bloodstream, it mobilizes glucose from the liver and diverts blood from internal organs. The adrenal cortex is the outer part of the adrenal gland. It secretes glucocorticoids, such as cortisol. These are steroid hormones that are derived from cholesterol. Over time, more and more steroid hormones are released, the more negative consequences an individual is likely to experience. Let's review these two aspects of the physiological stress response, starting with the SAM response. SAM stands for sympathetic adrenomedular. The SAM response is generally activated by acute mild stress. In this pathway, the amygdala releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, which then triggers the sympathetic nervous system via the hypothalamus as well as other nuclei. This includes the lateral hypothalamus, the locus coeruleus that produces norepinephrine, the ventral tegmental area that produces dopamine, and the pedunculopontine, which is often abbreviated as PPN. This is a nuclei that produces acetylcholine. We'll talk more about the SAM response in terms of anxiety later into the course. But for now, it's important to know that the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal medulla to release norepinephrine and epinephrine in the peripheral nervous system. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical response is a neuroendocrine circuit. Here, The response is not so much to acute mild stress, but to chronic stress and/or insufficient SAM response. In this pathway, the paraventricular nucleus at the hypothalamus releases corticotropin-releasing hormone. From there, CRH triggers the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropin hormone to the bloodstream. ACTH triggers the adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids and culminates in glucocorticoid release, for example, in cortisol release. From here, glucocorticoids like cortisol bind to glucocorticoid receptors, which actually inhibit HPA activity. Therefore, rising glucocorticoid levels trigger a negative feedback loop. Thereby, higher levels of glucocorticoid inhibit further activity of the HPA, so that the system begins to calm down. Glucocorticoids are steroid hormones. They help with preparation for stressors, the response to stressors, and recovery from stressors. They also activate neurons in the brainstem to stimulate sympathetic arousal. Other steroid hormones include androgens, estrogens, progestins, and mineralocorticoids. Glucocorticoids help regulate normal blood glucose levels and help store excess glucose for future use. While glucocorticoid release is adaptive in the short term, high levels of glucocorticoid release over longer periods of time do damage the brain and are associated with an increased risk of depression. Different stressors generate different responses, both physiologically and psychologically. Sympathetic arousal is more related to anxiety and vigilance, whereas glucocorticoids are more linked to our hormonal response to stress. And again, heavy secretion is linked to depression. In addition to glucocorticoid release, there are several other hormonal aspects of the stress response. For example, the pituitary gland secretes prolactin, which suppresses reproduction, endogenous opioids, such as endorphins and enkephalins, vasopressin, which is an antidiuretic hormone, and it inhibits growth hormone, which in children can lead to stunted growth. Whereas adults are fully grown and therefore will not experience stunted growth from stress in adulthood, low growth hormone in adults is associated with abnormal body composition and increased risk for various diseases. The pancreas secretes glucagon in response to stress, which raises circulating glucose levels. Moreover, it inhibits insulin release, which further raises circulating glucose levels. In terms of the gonads, individuals experiencing stress also will experience inhibited reproductive hormones, which leads to less sexual desire and impaired sexual performance. This includes estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. You've probably heard about the connection between high stress and cardiovascular diseases. So let's talk about the cardiovascular stress response. For those of you who like to pause the recording to watch the videos, you might pause here to watch the video Stress and Blood Vessels. So cardiovascular is made up of cardio for heart and vascular for blood vessels. There are many changes to the cardiovascular system that occurs in response to stress. One of those is that stress leads to increased relaxation, otherwise known as dilation, of arteries. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Therefore, by dilating arteries, it leads to increased blood flow to muscles, which also increases energy to those muscles. Blood flow is diverted to major muscle groups that are involved in survival-oriented behaviors, such as the quadriceps, which are needed in order to run as quickly and as far as possible. Stress also leads to decreased blood flow to the digestive tract. You might have noticed that when people are stressed, they oftentimes will make comments like butterflies in the stomach or a rock in the stomach, or otherwise just refer to stomach aches in general. This is because part of the stress response is to decrease blood flow to the digestive tract. The reasoning for this is quite simple. Digestion is relatively unimportant when it comes to survival. So, if your body has to decide between using all of its energy to run away from that lion or to digest the steak you had earlier, it will always choose to shut off digestion in favor of survival-oriented behaviors. Stress also decreases blood flow to the kidneys, which reduces urine formation. As mentioned previously, vasopressin is increased in response to stress. Vasopressin, the antidiuretic hormone, blocks diuresis, which is urine formation. The goal of this is to increase blood water. Some people refer to the hormonal triad, which includes aldosterone, angiotensin, and vasopressin. The mission of this hormonal triad is to preserve bodily fluids and salts. They're all changes driven by the hypothalamus. Whereas the kidney is bidirectional and is able to reabsorb water, the bladder is unidirectional and will only be able to eliminate. Therefore, once fluid has reached the bladder, part of the stress response is to release the bladder, which is a muscle that requires quite a bit of energy to hold. This serves two major purposes. One, to relax the bladder muscle so that energy is not being wasted. And two, to release weight from the body. Water is heavy, and if you need to run as fast as you possibly can, releasing that urine is a really positive and adaptive response to lessen weight. Lastly, stress leads to constriction of veins leading to the heart. This means increased rigidity. You can think of it as being similar to a stretched rubber band that snaps back with more force. The returning blood comes through these veins with higher force, similarly to that. What happens here is that because of this rigidity, blood pressure increases. Hypertension is a technical term for chronically elevated blood pressure. The definition of hypertension is a systolic, which is the upper number, above 140, and a diastolic, which is the lower number, above 90. That is, a blood pressure that is above 140/90. The systolic part of blood pressure refers to the force with which blood is leaving the heart, whereas diastolic refers to the force with which blood returns to the heart. Individual differences in heart rate variability also plays a role in how people respond and recover from stress. People who have low heart rate variability, often referred to as HRV, have trouble turning off their stress responses. In contrast, those with high HRV tend to recover more quickly. In these individuals, heart rate speeds up upon inhalation, which is activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and slows upon exhalation, which activates the parasympathetic nervous system response. Exhalation-induced parasympathetic nervous system activation is why breathing exercises tend to focus on the out-breath. As has been the theme so far, short-term stress responses are adaptive, helpful, and relatively harmless. However, when chronic stress begins to build up, problems do occur. As mentioned on the previous slide, hypertension is a blood pressure above 140/90. Chronic hypertension can lead to thicker muscle layer, and that occurs as a body's attempt to control the increased force of blood flow. That leads to increasingly higher levels of rigidity, which is a vicious cycle. More rigidity leads to higher blood pressure, which leads to more muscle formation, which leads to more rigidity. Eventually, this can lead to a condition known as left ventricular hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is basically an enlargement of an organ or tissue. It occurs in the left ventricle of the heart wall because that is where the increased muscle formation tends to occur. That leads the individual to a lopsided heart, which leads to an increased risk of irregular heartbeat and cardiac issues. You need more blood than the artery can supply. The heart is lopsided because blood flow occurs only in the left ventricle. Again, this increases the risk of an irregular heartbeat as well as increased risk of other cardiac issues because the body requires more blood than the arteries can supply. Hypertension also creates vulnerability to injury at points of bifurcation, which are the areas where the vessels branch off. Vessels bifurcate into smaller and smaller vessels, and from there into thousands of tiny capillaries. Small points of vessel damage lead to an inflammatory response, which can then lead to plaque formation that further increase cardiac risk. Plaques form from surrounding platelets, fat, cholesterol, and other substances that are mobilized by the stress response. Atherosclerosis is an accumulation of plaques that even further increase the risk of negative outcomes. The risk is related to damaged vessels. If it's not damaged, it's less likely that plaques will stick to the interior lining and create a clog. Cholesterol, therefore, is not necessarily bad and isn't a great marker of heart health. C-reactive protein, however, appears to be a better marker of cardiac risk than cholesterol. C-reactive protein is created in the liver and secreted in response to a signal that indicates injury. It migrates to damaged vessels where it helps amplify the inflammatory response. The last thing we'll discuss in this lecture presentation is how stress-related cardiovascular dysfunction can lead to heart attacks and strokes. You might consider pausing the recording here to watch the videos What Happens During a Heart Attack and What Happens During a Stroke. Alternatively, you might wait till the end of the lecture presentation to view those videos. A thrombus is a mobile plaque that dislodges and travels to other areas of the body. Semi-clogged blood vessels leading to the heart can lead to a condition known as myocardial ischemia, which essentially is a disrupted or low flow of glucose and oxygen due to the clog. Once this occurs, sympathetic activation causes vasoconstriction, which is a normal part of the stress response. That can cause angina pectoris, which is intense chest pain that occurs in response to stress. Much more concerning than the risk of angina pectoris are the risks of heart attacks and stroke. A clogged coronary artery can lead to a heart attack, which is technically referred to as a myocardial infarct. Similarly, a clogged blood vessel in the brain can lead to a stroke, which is a brain infarct. There's conflicting information about the role of estrogen in cardiovascular health. It appears to be helpful for decreasing the formation of plaques, but it does not reverse them. Therefore, it serves as more of an early life protective factor than an effective treatment approach. An intense reaction to stress, whether it be fear, anger, grief, joy, or a host of other responses, increases the risk of sudden cardiac death. That might surprise some of you who might think that positive stress, like joy, wouldn't increase the risk. However, this does occur, and it's potentially due to the uncoordinated symmetrical projections to the heart that become rapid and disorganized contractions. Individuals with low heart rate variability who have trouble turning off the stress response are particularly likely to experience poor outcomes in response to chronic stress.